Good morning. I'm Jennifer Barkin, and here's my co host, Jennifer Donaldson. And welcome to Breakup Bites, our podcast. Today, our topic is Voice of the Child reports. Now, Voice of the Child reports are fairly new in Ontario. I think it was actually during COVID, wherein the Family Law Act changed and said that children have a right to have a say in matters that concern them. So, a Voice of the Child report is a way to have the children's voice heard.
What's so wonderful about that is a lot of times parents will go back and forth saying that they know what their child wants and what's best for their child. And sometimes it's just really important to have the child voice what it is that's important to them because sometimes the parents won't either hear it because they're dealing with a whole bunch of other things, and sometimes the child will say things just to appease the parent because they don't want to make the parent feel bad. So having a third party come in who's neutral and will just speak to the child to actually really hear what the child is saying. And it's really important. But one of the things that I love about this the most is that as a voice of a child reporter, you have to go in and get the consent from the child. So the child has to say if they're willing to share this information or not. And after you go through all of the different questions, the child will have to approve again if they're willing to share that information or not. So it's really helpful for the child to have that control and say so they feel comfortable. And it's helpful for the courts to actually see what the child did feel comfortable sharing. And if they didn't feel comfortable sharing something, that shows something in its own.
Exactly. You brought up a good point. You had said that, parents will say, "Oh, I know what my child wants. We have a very open, good relationship. My child tells me all the time." My argument for that is children will also tell a different story to each of their parents. They tell each parent what they want to hear. Why? Because they love their parents. They don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to make either parent feel bad. So sometimes you're getting two very different stories, and that's why dad hears this, mom hears this, but that's actually not what the child wants. So the voice of the child is actually a process. There's a process to the voice of the child. And I'd always recommend to anybody considering getting their children's voice out there to ensure that they work with somebody who has trained in the voice of the child. So typically the people trained to do voice of the child are social workers and therapists and people comfortable with interviewing children, right? So it's very different to interview a child than it is to interview an adult. Like if you think if a child goes to therapy, you're not going to put a child on the couch and say, "How are you feeling today?" Right? The therapist is going to have to develop some sort of rapport with the child to get the child comfortable. So, with the voice of the child, for our listeners, there's actually a process that we follow. Jennifer's trained to do voice of the child. I'm trained to do voice of the child. We meet with each parent individually first. We do an intake meeting. From the parents, we learn what they want to know from their child. What sort of questions should we be asking? What are they hoping to find out from this report? And during this intake meeting, we also make very clear to the parents that they're not to coerce the child, manipulate the child, guilt the child, bribe the child, get angry with the child, whatever the outcome is going to be. The whole purpose is to really hear the truth, what the children are feeling, what the process of what they're going through is, and what their needs, wants, and wishes are for their own lives.
Mhm. And the point that you brought up, which is so important, is when we speak to the parents, we talk about how it's important for them not to manipulate the child or try to force the child. But we'll usually find out if that does happen, because even if the child doesn't outright say, "Well, mommy or daddy told me to say this," we have ways around it to really understand what it is that's coming from the child or what's coming from either parent. And the reason I say this is because I have some clients who are not really for the voice of the child report because they're afraid that the other parent will manipulate the child. But it
Mhm.
doesn't usually go in their favor, even if they do attempt to do that. And it is a voluntary process, so both parents do have to agree unless it is ordered. But it is a very important process to go through because now, as Jennifer said, there's a lot more weight given to how the child is feeling and what it is that they're wanting to say so their voices can be heard.
I'll add that another reason for the intake meeting with the parents is for us to sort of gauge if the child is going to be influenced. Because there are situations where the voice of the child report is not appropriate because there will be undue influence no matter how much you try to speak to that parent not to do this. And in those cases, it's not appropriate for everybody.
Mhm.
But when it is appropriate, it is a very good tool. So the process, if I can talk a little about this as such, we'll do the intake meeting. We will let the children know that this is your opportunity to talk about what you want and what's bugging you or what how could things be better for you. But we're only going to bring back to your parents and perhaps counsel if they're involved in litigation of any kind what you are willing to share, as you eloquently said. And typically, during the first meeting with the children or child, we will develop rapport with that child. We're not going to just jump into it. We have to get the kids comfortable. So maybe at the intake, we've learned that this child is a hockey fan or this child is really into My Little Pony, whatever it may be. So we can develop some rapport and then we will explain the process. We'll let the children know, hey, you're in control here. This is for you and we're not going to take back anything that you don't want us to say. So we'll get into our questioning. We'll typically meet with the kids again and review all those answers, maybe tie up some loose ends if there's some other things that maybe should be asked or clarified. But the children are going to approve every last sentence that goes in that report. And also, it the writing that's in this report is not in my words, it's not in your words. We are taught we write specifically the children's words. It's the children's voices, and that's what the parents receive.
Mhm. Right. And also, we typically don't see children under the age of 8. There are exceptions once in a while if a child is more mature. We all know those children that are 7 and they act like they're 15. But there's different children that it would be more suited for and not depending on their age.
Exactly. So we speak a lot about the chronological age versus the developmental age.
Mm. Right.
Because you can have a child per se that's, I don't know, low functioning in a certain area, and they can be 13 years old. And this, if the child cannot really understand what's being asked, it's not an appropriate process.
Right. So we definitely believe in Voice of the Child reports, and if anyone has any questions, we're happy to answer them. But that's just a little bit of an insight to what the Voice of the Child is.